I am a former judge from former Yugoslavia. I came to Canada in 1997, and from 1998 I got engaged in conflict prevention work in the Balkans mostly. That's the field in which I was involved from 1998 till my retirement 3 years ago. Right now I'm retired. But I'm also very actively involved with the Canadian Institute for Conflict Resolution, in which I provide some training, and also I'm a member of the community of practice over there. And I never left this field of conflict prevention and resolution, coaching and mentoring anymore, but constantly in touch in a kind of advisory role for some of my former students who became much better trainers than myself now. I am very proud that there is that relationship from very first training in 1998, for example, that I've done in Bosnia, that I'm still in touch with many of those people. And whenever they need some advice or a sounding board when they're facing some difficulties, I'm there for them. That's where I'm at right now. The law is, I'm a lawyer, but I studied law at the University of Belgrade very, very long time ago. I graduated in 81 and took different positions as a lawyer in Yugoslavia. The last position I had was a position of the judge of the municipality court of municipality of Jajce. Unfortunately, it was only for 2.5 years because then the war started and I left. So that's my background, that's my education, that's my profession. But since the war started, the idea of justice and law shifted significantly, and it took quite some time for me so it took me probably 6 to 7 months to finally have a conversation with him and say, maybe I should try to do that. I think we have to understand that in this kind of work, when you are issues and larger community and society issues, there are too many steps you have to go through. Not to mention that I would be leaving my children here and going to do overseas work. So there was a lot of that. But I think I liked the idea of win-win conflict resolution approaches. And I also simply didn't want to go back in the law field. That was something that I decided wasn't for me at that point anymore. And I'm quite happy with the decision that I made, because I couldn't imagine, after I took that first training in 1997, that would be my profession. Till retirement, I worked for over 10 years as a consultant for the Canadian CEDA-funded project, a World Bank-funded project, some European Union-funded projects, UN projects, and eventually ended up with United Nations Development Program at the position of conflict prevention specialist. And I was basically providing support to what they call, what UN language calls insider mediation capacities around the world. That's what happened, without too much thinking, without really wanting to change your profession, but simply, I think I found a niche in which I felt quite good. It was like, this is where I belong, and I'm still happy with the decision. Okay. At the very beginning, I didn't work on any conflict resolution per se. We were not resolving any issues. Because I was working with Canadian Institute for Conflict Resolution, which is a training institution. When I say we, it was me and another colleague from the institute who is Canadian trainer. We were delivering basic conflict prevention, conflict resolution training. It's called third-party neutral training to various groups of the people over there. First, it was a pilot project in 2 cities, Banja Luka and Mostar. You probably heard about Mostar. It's still very, very challenging place, totally divided. And of course, now people are feeling more free to cross the river and go from one side to the other, but there is still no life back to normal. And I'm not even sure if it ever happened that they really reintegrate the way it was before the war. So there was a pilot project funded by CEDA. So we delivered 2 trainings. The Institute believes it's a training intervention as well, which proved to be true. That included some of them that weren't even sure if they wanted to spend 5 days together in the group with enemies. They stayed together and organized the local NGO called Initiativa M. They were facilitating a process of return in Herzegovina region for over 3 years since that training. Nobody expected that. The expectation was to bring people together, they have a good week together, they get basic understanding of conflict resolution. And, God knows what happens with that. But the power of people wanting to do something together was really something that nobody expected. And I helped them register that NGO, and they were legally established. They worked for 3-4 years, but I don't know what happened later on. That was a pilot project. After that, SIDA gave us funding for additional 3 years. At that point, there was more acceptance and inclusiveness in terms of having people from all walks of life. It was very difficult to bring people from public services, from political parties, etc. But eventually that started changing because we were there for 4 years. And delivering a training, but at that point it was not only basic training, we started delivering more of facilitation training and mediation training as well. And we brought a few groups of people here to Canada, including election officers. They came here because during the elections there are so many issues, that they have to resolve on spot. So that was one group of people. Then we brought a group of people to be trained as trainers. And they went back and they continued doing the trainings. When the project ended, there was a huge question mark about sustainability. So what will happen after 3 years of really good project, and you can see that people grasped it and they wanted to use the new skills and learning. So the Association of Mediators lobbied for the drafting of the law on mediation, of course with support of Ministry of Justice, and at that time there was ABASILI, American Bar Association, that was involved in judicial reform. And the project I was running, they had to continue working on their own. And I'm saying this because I'm really, really struggling with sustainability of the projects that I observed around the world. So they did that. The law was adopted at the parliament. They opened 2 mediation centers, one in Banja Luka, the other in Sarajevo. They're both active right now. I'm following on that. They are doing mediation training for the mediators over there. So there are, I don't know, over 100 mediators registered in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they are associated with the courts because mediation in Bosnia and Herzegovina is a court annexed or court connected mediation. But only in the first month, at that point I was already involved in work on the development and pilot projects of establishing those mediation centers in Banja Luka and Mostar through the World Bank. I was hired by the World Bank to do that. And only in the first month, a few millions of, at that time it was a German mark, what was the terminology they used? It was stuck in court processes. So people took mediation and they could get their money in a very short period of time because they made the agreement. So that was very successful, especially in Banja Luka, later on in Sarajevo. Everyone was talking about that, there were articles all over it. It was quite a success. The center in Banja Luka is very active even now, in Sarajevo also, but not to the same level because it also depends on constantly educating judges to refer the cases to mediation because it depends on judges. They refer the cases. This is something that could go to mediation, and they refer them, and that culture seems to be more developed in Banja Luka court. But 6-7 years of work in mostly in Bosnia, but I was also involved in development of the capacities, mediation capacities for the court connected through the judicial reform project. It was SIDA funded. I forgot the name of the agency that hired me, Genivar, which was a bit bizarre because it's a construction company. I was hired by them and I was a lead advisor on mediation development later on with the World Bank as well. So there was work in Serbia and Macedonia. Macedonia pretty much used the model of Bosnia and replicated it. In Macedonia, in Serbia, there is a different model because judges are mediating over there, similar to court. Settlement judges are performing mediation. And I was also involved a little bit in mediation, court-to-court related next mediation in Croatia. So pretty much covering that part of world from 98, when I first went with the basic conflict resolution training, all the way up to 2007. I was very actively involved in that part of the world, always as a consultant and the advisor, with different organizations. The mediation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the work in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So that's what has been done. I'm trying not to give you too much information that might not be useful. I worked with UNDP for the last 13 years. Yeah. So as UNDP, a conflict prevention specialist, I was basically covering, that's a terminology, West and Central Africa and South Africa, Balkans, of course, and some other European countries, and some countries in Latin America, working mostly as I call it project manager. I managed what they called insider mediation for UNDP. That's pretty much similar to everything we are doing in conflict prevention field in general, but it's really focusing on developing national capacities. Insider mediation is a terminology that doesn't necessarily mean mediators. It really means everyone involved in peace. And it could be lobbying, it could be advocating, it could be facilitating something. So the terminology for insider mediation is adopted in theory and in UNDP vocabulary. There is a guidance note, Engaging with Insider Mediators, which basically describes the whole concept. Because there is, and the need for that came from the understanding that high-level mediations or high-level peace agreements don't last. We know that lots of peace agreements fail in 2 years or 5 years, depending, mostly because there are no local capacities, there are no local systems to follow, and to basically make sure that that's been implemented. And then I think that's Lederach's idea, to work with people who are mediators or peace builders who have a vested interest in the resolution. That's a big difference between insider mediators who are very interested in the outcome because they are a part of outcome and they are going to live with that outcome, in comparison to external mediators who come at a very high level. High-level mediation is extremely needed and necessary. Experiences are showing that there is a more and more need for locally owned capacities who would be able to maintain, or what is a new UN terminology, sustain the peace. We were developing all over the world. I was managing the project. It was EU and UNDP joint partnership on insider mediation. There were 14 countries in which I was directly involved in developing those capacities through various approaches, because, the entry points sometimes are not there for conflict prevention work. Sometimes you go with development projects and do your conflict prevention or resolution work through the project or whatever else. And when you look to this particular guidance note is talking about 14 of those countries in which we did it with the partnership, under the partnership with the United Nations, with the European Union. Of course, there are other cases that are described here, but those 14 are basically there providing the understanding on how large the field is, how different the approaches are, and how different the needs of the countries are. We really have to understand the local reality to make sure that we are helping them, not that we are providing, that we are helping them developing the best capacities for their own needs, to make sure that the transformation happens, that from conflict they move towards something that is peaceful coexistence, or whatever would be the right terminology for that. It really depends on the context, and there are different approaches. For example, there was something in African countries, there was Accra Declaration that was adopted, again, I don't remember exactly the year, in which the African countries agreed that they will develop so-called infrastructures of peace. The idea was to develop something at the national level, usually National Peace Council or whatever the name would be, but there would be a body that is in charge of reconciliation, peace council, whatever the terminology would be. And some countries started with that. They will have it at a very high level, usually with very prominent people being the chairs of that, like Bishop in Togo, or somebody of a very, very high national influence. They have to have credibility, influence, and they also have to be dedicated to do what they were doing. And like I said at the very beginning, they have to be vested. They have to have vested interest in resolution of the. So that would be the approach, for example, that was adopted in African countries. And most of the countries try to do it similar to what Ghana did, develop regional capacities or local capacities. And who are the people who would be involved in that? Those are basically people who are peacemakers in their communities in everyday lives anyways. So ordinary people, but quite often, depending on the structure of the society, they had to be somebody who is a leader, local leader or chief, what would be differences in some of those countries. Women would be involved in that. In some of the contexts, that was extremely important to have them leading those processes, because depending on the society, women in some of those society have a very, very strong role as a peace builder, peacekeepers and whatever. Some of them really do mediate cases. Some of them are just, facilitating conversations, having people coming together to talk. So that's when I said it's quite. I was even surprised myself, why do they call them mediators? Because I'm a lawyer, So I think in terms of the definition of mediation, but that's the terminology that has been accepted, and it really encompasses a huge different capacities and fields of activities that those people are. So it could be youth, it could be women, it could be local leaders, it could be politicians, political parties members, depending of the reality of the particular country. For example, in Zimbabwe, we were training pastors because they're so influential. And somebody told me, you actually have to train pastors' wives. And we did that, and guess what? It really did work better, because they are daily, the pastors have, I would say, job. Maybe that's not the right way to describe it. So this is what they do, is an official duty. Of course, they do it outside of the church. But the pastor's wife have influence with the other wives around the villages. So that's something that, when you do your analysis as an outsider, you don't think about that. And I think what is extremely important is to just listen to what people are telling. Just listen to what works for them. You might have the best idea ever that might not work. So that's how those capacities are developed. And like I said, quite often those projects would go under different umbrellas, because in many of the countries, when you come and said conflict prevention, conflict is also what you're talking about, we are okay. So that's the model that was pretty much applied in many of the African countries in which we worked. Togo, Ghana, Malawi, Zimbabwe, most of them did establish some of the either very high-level Truth and Reconciliation Commission, National Peace Council, different names, that they had. And they also didn't necessarily work the same way. Some of them actually started organically from the field and then eventually said, but we need something at the top. But some started from the top to bottom. So that's how it worked over there. In Latin America, for example, most of our insider mediator works and capacity development was related to the national resources and indigenous peoples' rights. So lots of work with indigenous peoples, and because mining is something that is extremely important over there, but also extremely conflict sensitive because of the rights of indigenous peoples. Bolivia, Guatemala, Honduras, I think we had some other of those countries in the projects. Most of that was directly linked with the work on land and natural resources use. We are trying not to get involved in any politics because the neutrality is a part of the approach. But yes, of course, that's what is being done. I think the first trainings in the field that I took here with Canadian Institute really resonate with everything that I worked later on. Even now, when I go back to the Institute, I said I took different trainings. I also participated in different trainings. I funded different trainings. And that's probably what's happened with most people. The core of your understanding is there. At the Institute, we always talked about positively centered activity. So there is an issue, for sure, because we are going there, because there is an issue. But you invite the community to join. not necessarily to talk about that particular issue, because you will immediately have the division, or some people said, I'm not going because that. You bring them to talk about something that is of common interest and that they would actually like to participate in talking about. And of course, then the issues of eventual conflict on how we resolve it, or why didn't we talk about that before, whatever the realizations would be there, are actually coming at the surface. And that's why those processes that are designed by professional conflict prevention or resolution practitioners are really important. Don't want to do harm by going in the communities that I wanted to talk about abortion. Yeah, guess what? So it's really about positively centering your activity in a way that is subtle, because you also don't want to trick people. People are very intelligent, what they want and what they don't want to talk about. All those steps you do in your preparation, starting from context analysis and trying to understand what's happening, which my colleagues are always making fun of me because I always talk to taxi drivers. Wherever we land, I get my information from taxi drivers. And they always said that because we are tired, jet lagged. They said, how can you talk to them? I said, just let me do it. Because that's the first layer of information I'm getting. I'm coming from New York with analysis of the country. You build, on that from what are you hearing. And you never know how good your analysis is. Of course, we do it the most professional way. But then there are so many layers and different state, society, community, family, individual to the room to deal with the issues. So the analyses are something that are extremely important. The well-designed process is extremely important. In my practice of facilitating community dialogues, I always insist on my facilitators to plan everything. And then I also tell them, but be ready to just tear it away. Because you can come in the room of 100 people and people say, no, we don't want to do it that way. We don't want to work in 5 small groups. We want all 100 people to sit here because we want to hear everything that's happening. And that happened. That happened a few times. You just come in a village and you have your fantastic project design, process design, said, you go with group A, B, C. And they said, no, we want to hear everything that is being said. I think flexibility is something that you also learn by doing, and it's extremely important. I did the analysis of one country, very small country, relatively easy to understand. 2 of us did the analysis. We were very happy. It's a Muslim country, Islamic country. The main issues are between Sunni and Shia Muslims, and we were very happy. The headquarters were very happy with the analysis. Few years afterwards, I was in one conference with somebody from that country, and we were talking about that. He said, did they ever tell you that they were all animalists? They believe in totems, the animal protectors of the family. And we said, nope. But that is additional layer, that would help you approach people from another angle if you knew it. Nobody ever mentioned it. So having somebody from the community itself who understand the culture, who understand the language, who understand the habits, the customs, everything, I think it's extremely important. I'm going back to the Canadian Institute. We always went abroad with 2 trainers, one national, one Canadian. Richard Bashinduka did a training in Rwanda. He is Rwandan. He passed away, unfortunately, in the meantime, with another trainer. In Taiwan, Steve Chen, who is Taiwanese, delivered the training. I went with him. Some other trainers also went. In Bosnia, it was me with Brian McQueen, who is Canadian. So, and it's actually quite good because I could get caught as the national who belongs to one of those 3 ethnic groups. I believe that I'm quite neutral, but I also have my own experience of the war. Having somebody who is an outsider and sees things with different lenses helps. If it was only him doing it, I would have a question mark about that Mostar training. Would it really end up with people staying together and organizing the association? Because that's a challenge, because some people don't trust you. You left, you didn't stay here, you don't know what we went through, we don't trust you. That's one side. The other side is you actually know what we are talking about. So, finding a nice balance between those 2 sides of how people see you, because they see you in both ways. Yeah, she is ours, but she wasn't here during the war. So that's a challenge. I know you had the question about challenge, so that just came to mind. I always talk about the project in Bosnia and Herzegovina as something that I am happiest about. Is it pride or whatever it is? It feels good. Because I had my own issues, I declined the first offer to do that because I knew I had to work on myself also. And I also thought that was too early, that was impossible because of the madness of the situation. So that's probably something that when I look back to everything that I have done, that's probably the most important piece of my work. For example, this mediation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, 100 questions and answers. This is the very first book, which is not a book, it's a booklet about mediation in the country. When I see that people are quoting it now in their PhDs, thesis and things, it feels good because you've done something, it's still there. And that's what is most important. It's not like when somewhere delivered training left, people were happy for 3 days and then they forgot about it, because that's the reality. You go back to your everyday lives. The fact that lots of people I trained became friends for life. They didn't know each other before those trainings. It just happened, that worked for them. Maybe they would become friends even if they met somewhere else, but I know that they met in those trainings. And like I said at the beginning, the fact that I'm still in touch with so many, it's been 30 years. I delivered my first training in 98. One of my first trainees, for example, we are constantly on WhatsApp because he works for KIC, King Abdullah, the organization. He works in Portugal, in Lisbon. I'm never talking about my work as a judge. I was probably proud with some decisions that I made, but that's another life. This is more powerful because it touches so deeply on human side, of people's lives. And I know there is a lot of gratitude, and not only from their side to me, from my side to them, because I think we grew together through all of this. I became, again, friend for life with many of those people, many, probably few dozens right now that we are constantly in touch. Not constantly, you don't do it on every day, but the real friendships are there. If you don't talk for 3 years, doesn't matter. You should just say, oh, that's you. So I think that's it. Not to mention the fact that after those trainings, we had the first association of mediators in the Balkans. The association drafted and adopted the law of mediation. There are 2 centers, mediation centers in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The model was replicated in some other countries in the region. My book is being used as a source. So that's factual. And that's important. And it's also, when I talk sometimes, even with my husband, I said, my God, I've done so much. Your goal at the end, the goal somehow came on its own because everything was organic. People really liked it. People really wanted to apply it. And I had a role. That's what I'm most proud of, probably. Being a judge. Yeah. Understanding yourself and being kind to yourself, because quite often we doubt ourselves. I said, oh, maybe I can't do that. And trust the people in the processes. I think that's really something that, because there is a huge dose of fear when you go in those settings. You never know what will happen. Being kind to yourself, even when you make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. But people help you. If you are present and kind to yourself and to them, they will help you walk through those processes, whatever those processes are, and trusting people in the processes. Because quite often we say, oh, that's a difficult setting, that's a difficult community, that's a difficult person. If we go with that mindset, you're probably not going to move far. And do no harm to yourself, because you could harm yourself through those processes, and don't harm the people in the community, because I've seen the projects in which it's fantastic ideas, I said, that's not going to work. You're going to make it worse. So understanding that and do no harm, in the largest meaning of that sentence, I think that would probably be the best one, best advice.